Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for staying with us till the final full session here. It's been a great day. So again, I'm Matt Notawadigdo. I'm one of the co-scientific directors at JPOL North America and a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. I joined in this role earlier this year, and I'm asked by my colleagues, like, what do you really do? Like, what's your job? And I don't know yet. No, well, one of the things that Laura Feeney told me that I'd be able to do when I started was try to build out additional work supporting research that's centered on racial equity. And I think that's part of the motivation for this session today, is to both, it's a coincidence, really. We're not in real time responding to what Gary said yesterday, but just by coincidence, I think we are trying to respond to that challenge. So that's, the goals of this session is kind of, I think, twofold. One is to kind of talk to all of you about what we're doing at JPOL so far in this space and get your thoughts and feedback on that and your questions. And then the second thing I hope to do is to kind of just discuss openly the challenges involved with doing this kind of research when you're centering on racial equity. So that's the goal. Let our two other panelists introduce themselves. We have Adam Gamerin from the William T. Grant Foundation. He's the president there, and Damon Jones is my colleague at University of Chicago, and he is also the scientific advisor at JPOL North America for this new work on racial equity, and he's been supervising a new committee of other scholars to support that work. I also want to mention that all of us have connections to University of Chicago. So I am at Chicago Booth, the business school, Iman is at the Harris School, and Adam here is an alum of University of Chicago with 3 different degrees from the University of Chicago. So we're really keeping it in the University of Chicago family right now. But let me turn it over and let you both introduce yourselves and kind of give your opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Damon Jones. I am a professor at the University of Chicago, just Harris School of Public Policy, and I'm also serving as a scientific advisor on racial equity. This is a topic that's been an interest of mine ever since I was old enough to recognize inequality in the places where I grew up, but also, in undergrad. And my research, I think the first, many years of my career, my research actually wasn't centered on racial equity. So this is a place where I've more recently pivoted. And so I'm still learning, but also excited to learn from others and try to build out some more infrastructure in this community to do research on those topics. And so I've been working with Matt and others under a grant by the Sloan Foundation to kind of pilot and start to think about doing more work on racial equity in JPOL. And so we put together a racial equity advisory committee, which is really cool, a collection of scholars, economists, and others, people who have done RCTs and those who have not, but who have an expertise in thinking about racial equity. And they've helped us to think about what we could do, what are the right questions to ask, what is the role of randomized evaluations in asking questions about racial equity, including asking, is this the right tool to answer some of the questions that we have or not. And so they've advised us, and we've worked on the RFP process here at JPOL and thinking about what can be tweaked there to better attract strong projects related to racial equity. And also, what are the practices at JPOL internally that can make the environment more conducive to doing this type of work. What we're trying to do is, in the long term, we're applying for more funding to continue this work and just generate some high-quality, rigorous research on racial equity. We want to start that off, actually, by hopefully bringing together maybe some of the people in our advisory committee and doing a literature review on randomized evaluations and racial equity in economics and other fields to kind of set the stage to think about where is that frontier. And then for researchers, we see 2 sets of researchers with expertise in racial equity, but maybe not as much of a background in doing randomized evaluations, and those doing random evaluations for years, but maybe wanting to think more carefully about how to do research on racial equity. So what kind of supports can we put in place? Resources, trainings and things like that to on-ramp people at this intersection. And then thinking about increasing the diversity of scholars in the network, both in terms of those who have a focus on racial equity, and also in terms of different dimensions of people's identity as well. So looking forward to the discussion this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt and Diman. I'm very honored to be here to speak to the JPAL community. As Matt mentioned, I'm the president of the William T. Grant Foundation, which supports research to improve the lives of young people. The foundation was founded in 1936 by William T. Grant, who thought that he was a store owner. He's from the Massachusetts originally. The first store was in Massachusetts. There were over 1,000 stores in the heyday of the company, and he thought that social science research would help him solve his number one problem, which was how to identify successful store managers. I never got an answer to that question, but he did support many important studies along the date. And the specific interests within our broad mission have changed over time depending on the pressing issues of the day. Today, the two areas of focus of the foundation are on reducing inequality in youth outcomes and improving the use of research evidence in policies and practices that affect young people, where by young people we mean those ages 5 to 25 in the United States. Now, why did we shift in 2014 to focus on reducing inequality in youth outcomes? Well, we have a four-part argument. First, inequality in the United States is excessive, and you can see that whether you compare the United States to other Western democracies or you look at the United States in comparison to our own past history. Second, excessive inequality is harmful. It's a drag on our economic productivity, and it is socially divisive. But third, we are not paralyzed in the face of inequality. On the contrary, much of the inequality we see today is of our own making, and we can undo it if we have the will to do so and the knowledge. And that's where the fourth point comes in, and I'm pretty sure in a room full of researchers that if you accept my first, second, and third point, you'll also agree with my fourth point, which is we need research to identify programs, policies, and practices that will, in fact, reduce inequality. And why the focus on the use of research evidence? Well, here we are, a funder of research, where we're actually trying to improve the lives of young people. We're committed to the idea that research has a role to play in discovering the avenues, the pathways through which young people's lives can be improved. But if the research sits on the shelves of a library, it's not improving anybody's lives. So, at one point there was this idea that the reason research doesn't get used is because the research is not credible. But in fact, it turns out that the use of research depends a lot more on the quality of relationships between producers and consumers of research and the intermediary organizations who bring them together than it does on the quality of the research itself. So how can we discover robust strategies for improving the use of high-quality social science research? That's our second focus area. Now, why racial inequality? Why did we call out racial inequality as one of the primary areas we wanted to incorporate into our reducing inequality funding portfolio? Well, we launched this effort in 2014, shortly after Michael Brown had been murdered by police in Ferguson, Missouri. Racial inequality in education is endemic. We heard about the racialized basis of homelessness and housing discrimination, racial inequality in lending. In 2020, we had a racial reckoning. We're now confronting a significant backlash to improvements in racial equity that occurred as a result of that racial reckoning. So anybody who is focused on reducing inequality must confront the reality of racial inequality in the United States. The racial roots of American inequality go back to the founding of this country, and they did not end with the cessation of slavery. In fact, each historical era has had its own forms of racial oppression. The imposition of white supremacy continues to this day. President Biden just recently called out white supremacy in speaking of the recent tragedies in Florida. And so clearly it's got to be a priority if you're taking seriously the mission to reducing inequality. Now at the foundation we have three major funding streams, and I want to emphasize that doors are open for J-PAL researchers to apply for funding to the William T. Grant Foundation. First, we have our major research grants, which support research in the two priority areas that I just mentioned. There are 3 deadlines a year for letters of inquiry, and then this, if you're fortunate enough to get an invitation for a full proposal, that then goes out for external review, similar to a federal funding agency. So that's the major research grants portfolio. We also have the William T. Grant Scholars Program, which is a career development opportunity for early career scholars within 7 years of the PhD. You can't just apply for the William T. Grant Scholars Program. You have to be nominated, and each institution, each major division of an institution, like a college or school, may nominate 1 candidate per year. And that provides 5 years of funding, and the institution has to guarantee at least a 50% teaching release. And then the third is our Institutional Challenge Grant, which challenges universities to build a partnership with a nonprofit or government agency to jointly develop and execute a research agenda on reducing youth inequality, to build the capacity of the community partner to use evidence in its decision-making, and to shift the incentive structure within the university to encourage and support partnership-oriented, engaged scholars. We have at least 2 J-PAL affiliates who are winners of the Institutional Challenge Grant. Gustavo Babones, who was honored by J-PAL last night, was one of the first winners of the Institutional Challenge Grant. And Alicia Modestino, whose research was mentioned earlier today, is also an Institutional Challenge Grant winner. Gustavo's story is particularly relevant to this conversation because J-PAL allowed him to initiate, provided the resources to initiate the partnership with the Puerto Rico Department of Education, and then the Institutional Challenge Grant from the William T. Grant Foundation helped allow you to institutionalize and further solidify the funding. So there too, I urge J-PAL affiliates to think about the William T. Grant Foundation for as a potential funding opportunity. I'll just signal 2 key challenges, which I think we'll get into a little bit later on, about 2 key challenges of pursuing randomized evaluations on racial equity. One, I think, is especially salient for economists because you tend not to do this, which is deeply conceptualizing the racial basis of inequality and racial context of interventions to reduce inequality. And the second is the challenge of pursuing research on racial equity in a time of polarization. That was what was behind my question to Laurel Arnold, the backlash that many of us have experienced. We, in fact, have collaborated with Arnold Ventures on supporting research on prosecutorial reform, very interested in bail reform. There's been a tremendous backlash to the evidence-supported policies that have put in place, and we found this in many areas of our work. We support research on reparations for Black American descendants of slavery. We support research on racial socialization, on mitigating teachers' implicit bias, and on anti-racist pedagogy, and other areas that have generated backlash, so it's been a challenging focus, and we can talk more about that in the discussion.
Thank you both. Let's jump right in and talk about your point here on economists sometimes doing research that has an insufficient conceptualization of race. I'd like to hear from both of you about any thoughts you have about how the field could do better And any kind of specific examples or cases you have in mind would be great.
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Yeah, so thanks, Matt. This is a really important issue for us at the foundation, and one of our program officers has written an essay about this, which I tweeted out this morning. You should follow me and follow the foundation on Twitter, or X as it's now called, and you'll find a link to that essay. But basically, there are three arguments. One is, unless we think deeply about the role of race in generating the inequality that we are confronting, it's hard to design interventions that are specifically responsive to that aspect of inequality. So housing is a great example that, the homelessness interventions that we talked about this morning. Homelessness is in part a result of racial discrimination in housing, as well as racial discrimination in education and in economic opportunities. And so unless we think about discriminatory responses to housing opportunities, it will be hard to design a successful intervention. The second is to construct an argument in first the proposal and ultimately the research report about why this intervention is responsive to racial inequality. So often we get proposals that say, okay, I'm going to look at this intervention and then I'm going to see if there's heterogeneous treatment effects. But there's no argument about why there should be heterogeneous treatment effects. Sometimes applicants say, this intervention is going to have stronger effects for Black respondents or Latino respondents because they suffer more from the discrimination that created the inequality in the first place. But there's no explanation for why the intervention would have a stronger effect in that context. And then the third condition for success in responding to this challenge is measurement, operationalizing inequality in such a way that it's sensitive to racial differences. So that's our perspective on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what I would say would overlap with what Adam has said. So I agree with those points. I would reiterate the conceptualization part. So in the field of economics, I think a common way that we like to think about things is a little atomistic. It's just like there's an individual, inside of that individual are some attributes, and then there's something that happens to this individual, and because of their attributes, that'll determine what happens next. And so I don't think that people stop to think what it means or what race means to them when they are studying racial inequality or racial equity. And so I think that for economists, it would behoove us to think more about race as a process, as an outcome of a process. So people interact and strategically over a long period of time to construct different categories of racial groups. That's different than thinking about you're born with certain characteristics or genes and things like that make you a member of a racial group, but rather that at some point it was convenient to continue to reach an equilibrium where this is a group and that's a separate group, and different things can happen for each group, and there are some people that benefit from that. And so there's an ongoing investment in that process. And so when you think about things like that, then some of our common ways of thinking about research questions then need to be amended. So a lot of what we do with random evaluation, think about causal effects of things on other things, and thinking about a causal effect of your race on a thing is maybe not the best way to think about it, because this is not something that is manipulable in the short run with a switch, or it's not a treatment that you can change. It's a historical process, and it's endogenous. So, I think that there are, still a lot of opportunities to use randomized evaluations to ask questions in this area, but there's a lot of work, I think, to be more aware of these things when we do the type of research we do, which tends to have this kind of potential outcomes framework. I could have been white, I could have been black today. Today I'm black. This is what happens. And that doesn't. We like to hold everything else constant, and because race is a part of a multi-pronged historical project. It doesn't make a lot of sense to hold everything constant but change someone's race. Because there are a lot of things that are bundled into the group that you're in and what happens to you when you're a member of one group or the other, including things that have happened to your family before you were here over a number of generations. So we're not manipulating that. And so experimentally, people are manipulating those things over years and decades and centuries, but so we need to think differently about what do we mean when we're thinking about something like a cause of a problem.
Let me back up for a minute, and I'd like to ask you both to talk about your own workable definitions of racial equity, to hopefully use that as what we'll try to center research on in the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, so when we think about reducing inequality, we think about inequality in two senses. One is the overall distribution of some valued good, like income or test scores in a population. Mm-hmm. And the second is group differences. So we'd like to reduce the first. Can't be eliminated. Can't eliminate. You can't distribute income and test scores equally. But we know it doesn't have these kinds of outcomes don't have to be as unequal as they are today, because they used to be less unequal, and we had a perfectly productive economy and functioning society. So less inequality in the overall distribution. Group differences, however, should be eliminated. There's no reason in principle that blacks and whites should have different test scores on average, or different levels of income on average, or same for immigrants and or certainly second generation, those from immigrant origins and those from longer tenure in the United States. So eliminate group differences is what I mean by racial equity.
Yeah, that's a good question, and part of what we were doing with our Racial Equity Advisory Committee, we've been trying to think about what's the definition we would use, and there's not one definition. So that was the one thing we came away with from our deliberations. One way to think about it related to what I was just saying is like, you can think about this concept of stratification as an ongoing process to strategically group people and then put them in a hierarchical ranking in their ways that you can benefit from that. If I can make this group subaltern, I can make this group acceptable to be treated differently. I can pay them lower wages and have more profit. So let me invest in a belief that this group is inferior, for example. So you could think about stratification as that process. And then when you think about racial equity, it just feels like when we say that, do we mean something different than racial inequality? And I think they're related, but racial inequality is the measuring of different outcomes across racial groups, and then I would think equity might be the counter process, or undoing that process of stratification, or working towards in a way to counter that stratification, which is an ongoing thing that happens.
Great, thank you both. Let's now switch gears a little bit, and I'd like to hear from you both some examples of where you think social science has done well, centering the research on racial equity.
Am I allowed to go outside of economics?
Sure.
Okay. So we are supporting research by Adriana Umanya-Taylor, who's a psychologist here at Harvard, or over there at Harvard.
That's right, it's over there.
Yeah.
This is MIT.
Right, sorry. I was just thinking Boston for a second. Sorry about that. Anyway, and her research is on young people's racial and ethnic socialization and identity formation. And it turns out that if you can strengthen young people's identity, they can dispel some of the internalize negative socialization that occurs due to discrimination and results in better social, emotional, as well as academic outcomes. I guess I do have one from economics, although it's not randomized evaluations, but Sandy Darity is perhaps the foremost scholar speaking about reparations for American descendants of slavery today. And he had a book called From Here to Equality, which lays out the racialized state stemming from the arrival on this continent of Europeans on this continent to the present day, and then use that to make the case for reparations. So what we funded him to do is to study the practicality and feasibility of reparations. So who would pay, how much, how would the funds be distributed, and where would the funds come from? These are very practical questions that would have to come from reparations. So gets at the heart of anti-black racism and responding to that for this country.
Yeah, I'll do one non-randomized evaluation and randomized evaluation. I think so. One study that comes to mind is Laura Derenoncourt's work on migration, black migration in the 20th century, and I think the point there is that in some of her work, she looked at what happened when black people migrated to certain neighborhoods in the north or areas, regions in the north from the south. And, a lot of times in economics, we might think, okay, there are different types of neighborhoods and there are these neighborhood effects, and let's move people to better neighborhoods. But when enough black people move to a neighborhood, it then becomes a black neighborhood, and then, that is different than what it was before they got there. And her research shows that a lot of things change in terms of the investments in that area or who lives there. And so I think it's useful to point out that it's not as simple as just changing some inputs or giving people access to certain assets. The way that race and racism works is that the value of the asset can be a function of the owner of the asset, independent of the underlying fundamentals of the asset. So you have a house, brick and mortar house, but now a black person lives in it, and so now it's a new house. Then Marcella Ausland's work, she has a number of different studies that I could pick, but in line with what Adam was saying, she did a study on what kind of doctors would have an effect on people's basically take up of preventative health measures and based on race and racial concordance. And there I think that, this wasn't the first study in the field of economics to say, okay, there's the race of the provider and the race of the patient. Would that lead to a different effect? But, I think there's that part about having a theory of why there would be this different interaction effect. In part informed by some of her work on the Tuskegee experiment and trust, especially with black men and doctors. And so there's not just a general concordance of finding that if the doctor looks like me, I do things differently, but it's if I am in a racial group or at the intersection of a gender and racial group that has a specific treatment or history, will I respond differently to certain types of doctors than someone who doesn't have that history? And in this case, that history is in part based on race and racism. So in some ways, the work can look very much the same in the sense that, look, if I there's an interaction between these two attributes of the doctor and the patient, but there's a little bit more underneath it in terms of, I didn't just test for this, but I had predictions about why this might happen and what interventions might offset it.
Thank you. Thank you both. Adam, you mentioned this issue of there being backlash to research that's done when that research is centered on racial equity. I was hoping that both of you could talk a little bit more about that. Perhaps both giving some examples as you already have, but also talking a little bit about what kind of thoughts or advice you have for researchers that are going to be doing this work in the future.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah. So this is interesting because some of the forms of backlash, I think there's very salient forms of backlash, like someone shows up with a flamethrower and burns your working paper because it's about race. But there's more subtle versions, and a bit of a connoisseur of racial discrimination. So like, you always have plausible deniability when these things happen. But what you see is like, there's a tendency to say that work that focuses on racial equity. So not just on racial differences. So if there are differences, racial differences in IQ. But if I'm like, there's a racial equity problem here, maybe this is an injustice or something like that. In economics and in general, there's this presumption that, this is biased work, that you have an agenda, that you want to reach a certain conclusion, and that, you may have just mined the data to get a certain conclusion, and either that's what you wanted to happen, or you knew that that was going to be well received on social media and by a top journal. That claim seems to suspiciously tend to be made about work on racial equity. It can be made about any study that's not pre-registered, but it tends to, I tend to hear it more and come across it more. And so that's one form of backlash where the research is not seen as credible because of the topic and because of the results. So if you find evidence of racial discrimination, there will be claims that you looked for it until you found it, now you're reporting it. And then there's, it's doubly nefarious if you are a member of that racial group. They have this term called me search, which is, you're doing research on black people and you're black, and how convenient that you found what you found in terms of your study. So there's an additional barrier. You're not granted the presumption of objectivity if you're a member of a marginalized group. It's an asymmetric standard as well. So, but I think like there sometimes one thing I try to remind my colleagues is like, how come, okay, so someone presents a paper on race and then the first paragraph talks about some pretty, some atrocities or racial incidents that happen, and then that already prompts people to think, I know this is a biased paper, and how come for climate change that's not, it's fine to talk about the doom. The earth is on fire, and that's a perfectly fine like scientific motivation of a paper, and then you talk about like, you presume that we want to have a better climate, and that could be for a number of reasons, but it doesn't catch the same kind of flack or accusation of being politically motivated. And so I think one of the things I try to do is to try to ask people to evaluate like, why in this case is this thought to be biased, and in other cases it seems perfectly acceptable to be motivated by like certain values. And so that's one of the things I do, but that's a form of backlash that's like, always hard to pin down.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I think that is so important and it needs to be exposed. It needs to be discussed, talked about in university departments and in forums like these. I'll just tell one story. When I learned about this, I didn't grow up sensitive to this challenge, but as a department chair, I had an African-American colleague teaching our undergraduate course on problems of American racial and ethnic minorities. Now this was a largely white department, African-American guy teaching the class on racial minorities. I thought, this is good. This guy will have more credibility than a white professor teaching about racial minorities. But to the racist audience of everyday Wisconsinites, it was suspicious. There was a lack of credibility, and this was just mind-blowing and shocking to me. And So we have to call this out. We have to be sensitive to it, because it's unfair and it's wrong. At the William D. Grant Foundation, we are very concerned about this issue, although for a somewhat different reason. For us, it's more about the context in which our researchers are working, whatever the racial background of the researchers. So I mentioned some of the different studies that we're supporting that have already engendered backlash. Backlash against mitigating teachers' implicit bias. Backlash against teaching ethnic studies courses in California and New Mexico. Backlash against strengthening young people's racial and ethnic identity. So how can we support our researchers who are doing this work in potentially difficult contexts? So we're doing 3 or maybe 4 things. First is we brought 3 researchers who have faced these challenges to our Board of Trustees, had a conversation about it, and that led to the formation of a learning community, a kind of a support group for researchers to talk about how they have dealt with these challenges in their work. Interestingly, many of the partners in the research want to keep the research going, and they say, let's keep doing this, but keep it under the radar. You know, don't talk about it so some school board member or some state legislator will light a fire under this. As long as we can avoid that kind of notice, we can keep doing this anti-racist research. The second thing we've done is to try to speak out about this challenge in contexts like today. And this, I think, is a role where the foundation has both a responsibility and opportunity. The third thing is that we find that sometimes partnerships can be an antidote to polarization. So when the researcher has a partnership with the community organization has the strength to resist this kind of backlash,